Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for American Studies annual Constitution Day debate and slightly different format. This is our first run at a Zoom debate and we're excited to have you all here today. It is my job today to tell you a little bit about our debate and about our guests who we have today. So first of all, we hold a Constitution Day debate every year to remind our students that there is an importance of civility in the United States and that intelligent people can disagree with one another without needing to be bitter or resentful. And I think our two guests today will demonstrate that quite nicely. They're on opposite sides of this very important issue, the Electoral College, and yet they can do so with levity and respect. And so I think it's a great thing to model around Constitution Day. I'm the Director of American Studies here at Christopher Newport and co-director of the Center for American Studies. I'm going to give you some very edited versions of the bios of our guests because they've won so many awards and published so many books, it would take the entire time for me to tell you everything about them, and then I'll hand things over to our moderator today. Our two debaters first, we have Akhil Reed Amar, the Stearling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, where he teaches both in the college and the law school. He's won numerous awards. He's won from the American Bar Association, the Federalist Society. He's been cited by the Supreme Court in almost 36 cases. He's written dozens of law review articles, several books, many of which have won awards, including The Constitution Today, named one of the year's top 10 nonfiction books by Time Magazine, America's Unwritten Constitution in 2012, one of the best 100 nonfiction books named by the Washington Post. He also writes in popular publications and consults for popular televisions, but I want to mention especially he's Yale's only current active professor to have won an unofficial triple crown of awards, the Sterling Chair for Scholarship, the Devane Medal for Teaching, and the Lamar Award for Alumni Service. Equally statured as our other panelist, Dr. Ellen Guelzo, the New York Times bestselling author, historian, and commentator on political issues, one of the Powerline's 100 top professors in America. He directs the James Madison Program Initiative in Politics and Statesmanship and is a senior research scholar for the Council of Humanities at Princeton University. Previously, he had served most of his career at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. Also, many award-winning publications, including his 2013 Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, for which he won the Lincoln Prize, the Guggenheim Lehrman Prize, the Fletcher Pratt Award, and the Richard Harwell Award for Atlantic Civil War Roundtable. He's awarded numerous teaching awards, including the Lincoln Medal, and I could go on and on. These are great teachers and scholars, and not to be left out is our moderator, who is also quite an accomplished teacher and writer. He is the Dean of our College of Social Sciences. His research focuses on civic engagement, especially in the American South. And he's received numerous internal teaching awards, but most notably the State of Virginia Award for Teaching, Outstanding Faculty Award, and the Teaching and Mentoring Award at Christopher Newport. His most recent book, The Rational Southerner, was nominated for several notable awards, including the VOK Award. So I could talk about awards all day, but we want to get down to business and talk about the Electoral College, which I don't think I need to tell us how important it is, but our panelists will do so. So I'm going to hand things over to Professor Kidd, and thank you so much for being here, all of you.
Thank you, Liz. And let me just welcome Professor Guelzo and Professor Amir virtually to campus. We hope to have you to campus in real life at some point in the near future. And just to say to everybody, we spoke before this started about how, how impersonal Zoom can be and how distant we all feel when we're in a Zoom session like this. And so we're going to use first names. I'm going to say Alan and Akhil, and I'm Quentin. We just think that might make things a little bit more personal and a little bit less sort of impersonal. The format, so Liz talked about the topic. The format is going to be this. I'll I'll give 15 to 20 minutes for each speaker to lay out their arguments about the Electoral College. It's absolutely a timely topic. The Electoral College has been in the news a lot in the last 24 hours, in fact. So 15 to 20 minutes for each of them, 5 minutes for each of them to respond to the other, and then we'll spend the rest of the time taking questions that you all will have submitted during this talk. We flipped coins in advance, or we flipped a coin in advance. Akhil won the toss, deferred to Alan, and so Alan goes first in the 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll come to Akhil. So Professor Alan Guelzo, the floor is yours. I don't know where he is, but
He's here. He needs to unmute.
okay.
Just am I now unmuted?
You are, yes.
All right. Well, thank you for reminding me of that. And let me start off by saying that I think there are four basic arguments, at least four, in favor of keeping the Electoral College in the form that we have it. The first, and it seems to me the most significant, is that the Electoral College underscores that our system of government is a federal system. We only got the Constitution because the Constitutional Convention persuaded the states to enter into a federation arrangement. We had had an earlier federation arrangement, the Articles of Confederation, which proved to be a spectacular failure, but not so much a failure that the states were willing to give everything up. So we adopt a new federal structure, but it's still a federation. Without the federation approach, we would have become balkanized. We would, according to the speculations of people who participated in the Constitutional Convention, have divided into 2, 3, perhaps even more confederacies. And in that way, the United States would have disintegrated into a series of well-nigh impotent little political arrangements, which in turn would probably have been a good meal for the existing empires, especially the empires on our borders, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, to have gobbled up. Rather than that, we structure everything in the Constitution around the federation idea because this was how we were able to achieve a national union. And in that federation idea, we divide powers between the states and the federal government. So we have a Senate. We have the states that ratify by state conventions. We have states that approve amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution can only be terminated by the action of the states in a national convention. So looking at it through all of these lenses, what comes right to the fore is the fact that federalism is in the bones of our nation, constitutionally speaking. And I would be concerned that we can't start removing bones without the whole body coming into jeopardy. Now, I'll come back to some of this in a few minutes, but let me at least put that point right out there at the beginning. The Electoral College is there because we are a federal system. Another thing that enters into the basic arguments for keeping the Electoral College is that the Electoral College embodies a fundamental instinct on the part of the founders, and that instinct was slow down. Ours is a slow-moving government. I don't know whether you've noticed that or not, but it is a slow-moving government. It's prone to gridlock, and we're prone to complain about gridlock. But the truth is that gridlock is not really an accident. The members of the Constitutional Convention had seen how the American Revolution had produced a flurry of state governments eager to distance themselves from the past by making everything into one man, one vote all the time. Deal with it quickly. Well, that produced spontaneity, but it also produced some stupidity too. The Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 is an example of that. The Constitution instead breaks down decision-making. It gives us the separation of powers. It gives us checks and balances. And the fundamental anxiety is you want to prevent power from endangering liberty. So the wisdom of the Constitution is slow down. Take things through a process which is broken down into segments. The Electoral College is a process of breaking down the election system and slowing it down. So once again, we're looking at something which is a fundamental aspect of what we are from the design of the Constitution. A third argument emerges out of what I would call an unexpected benefit of the Electoral College, and that is that the Electoral College forces candidates to appeal to a wider range geographically, a wider range of voters than otherwise. And what I'm saying is that presidents cannot win the presidential election just by appealing to California and New York, or by appealing to New York City, Chicago, Houston, LA, and San Francisco. That is a benefit of the Electoral College. It forces attention across the country. Now, this is not something that was necessarily intended by the founders. In fact, in some respects, it's not actually the best argument for the Electoral College. It means that instead of just appealing to 2 states, you're compelled to appeal to 10 to 12 states, those swing states that people are always complaining about. The truth is you do tend to leave the others just as neglected as if it would be otherwise. But look, 10 to 12 states is still better than appealing to just 2. So there is an unexpected benefit. It's not as dramatic as sometimes it's explained as being, but it's still there. A fourth unexpected argument, rather unexpected benefit, is that the Electoral College actually helps contain voter fraud. The founders had a fairly high degree of concern about voter fraud. Many of them, of course, had obtained their legal education through Blackstone's commentaries. And reading what Blackstone has to say about elections and knowing what we know about the way elections to Parliament occurred in the 18th century, popular elections were quite frequently brought about by influence, partiality, artifice, money. It reminds me of the Gilbert and Sullivan song about how the ruler of the Queen's Navy went by a pocket borough into Parliament. The American framers of the Constitution knew how prone that system was to fraud. And so voter fraud is something which acts as a factor in the American construction of the Constitution. The Electoral College acts as a restraint on fraud because there's no point to political parties playing fraud games in Montana or Idaho or Kansas because they just won't get much bang for their buck in terms of the electoral votes of those states. But if we move to a system where everything was based on a national total, then voter fraud, election fraud could be conducted everywhere. And trying to establish an accurate count would become a ceaseless nightmare. And the framers sensed this. Gouverneur Morris in the Constitutional Convention described how the Electoral College would guarantee that since, as he put it, electors would vote at so great a distance from each other, the great evil of cabal was avoided. It would be, he said, impossible to corrupt them. There is one other argument I'd put on the table here in addition to these 4 basic ones, and that is that without the Electoral College, states would have a wedge driven between them. And what I mean by that is this. Why should a state, especially a large state, which voted heavily for candidate A, concede the election of candidate B just because a host of people in smaller states voted for candidate B. What the Electoral College does is to add legitimacy to candidate A's election. And more on the legitimacy point in a minute. The irony of this, and I think this is one of the great ironies that emerges out of the Constitutional Convention, the great irony of all this is the expectation of George Mason in the Constitutional Convention that the Electoral College would actually not be a mechanism for electing the presidents very frequently, because the Electoral College would rarely generate sufficient majorities. And as he put it, 19 times in 20, elections would be decided in Congress. What he had not anticipated, of course, was the creation of political parties. Political parties helped to simplify that. And so, in fact, the Electoral College has acted in most cases as the mechanism for electing a president of the United States. So that then brings me to the question. Should we repeal? Should we reform the Electoral College? Well, to the argument for repealing it, I would have a question, and that is, why bother? It's too cumbersome. When the rise of political parties jammed the gears, so to speak, of the Electoral College with the election of 1800, Congress chose to revise and not to replace the Electoral College, and revised it through the 12th Amendment. So if we want to do something with the Electoral College, we could always consider an amendment, but repealing it entirely, I think that there we are putting ourselves on very soft ground. There has been a suggestion, and Akhil has been very prominent in shaping this suggestion, to move towards what's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. The problem with the compact is that it probably is not constitutional. You know, Article 1, Section 10 prohibits states from entering into any agreement or compact with another state without congressional approval. So assuming that congressional approval is not going to be forthcoming, the compact itself isn't going to have any substance. And even if it did have that kind of approval, there's no enforcement mechanism. So that a state that might commit itself to the compact at one point might decide in the actual event to pull out of it. Well, then where are we with that? The other problem I think that we face in eliminating the Electoral College is that it would foster something that we're not terribly well equipped to handle, and that is the generation of third-party candidates. And I'm talking not just third party, but fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth party candidates, because then everybody would have a motive for getting into things. The Electoral College tends to weed out third party, fourth party, fifth party, and in so doing confers legitimacy. Here we come back to the legitimacy question on those who are elected. And it's not an accident, I think, then, that 17 out of 29 US elections have actually been decided pretty straightforwardly by 200 or more electoral votes. The fundamental problem in all democracies is the problem of legitimacy. If sovereignty resides in the people and all the people have a say, what keeps them from breaking the government up whenever the decisions of the government go against them? Well, this is why legitimacy, and especially legitimacy in elections, is important. The Electoral College acts as a legitimizing factor on the results that we see from the national popular vote. And in so doing, it reinforces the legitimacy of whoever is, in fact, chosen president. Well, I've laid out some of these basic arguments. There are a number of other questions and a number of other objections, but I'm sure Akhil is going to take us to those. So I will cheerfully turn the floor now over to him and allow him to speak on the other side of the fence.
Thank you, Alan. Akhil, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Alan, you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Quentin. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, especially Alan. Alan and I we met 1 year ago, September of last year, in what was supposed to be a fierce debate over the Electoral College, and it was a friendly discussion, and we are indeed friends, and it's an honor to be with Alan once again to talk about this topic. I do think we have different views, but they overlap, and most important of all, it is important to understand that people who can have different views can respect and admire each other. So the big argument for reforming the Electoral College is a simple idea of equality. All American voters are basically equal to all other American voters, and your vote should count the same, whether you're a Californian or a Kentuckian, whether you're red or blue, whether you're black or white, whether you live in a city, whether you live in a suburb, whether you live in the countryside. That's the big idea. The institutional, that's a theoretical point. I'm just starting my stopwatch here to make sure I don't go over time. The theoretical point about equality can be supplemented by an institutional point. We have states. Federalism is important. And in every state, we have an official who's a lot like a governor. Excuse me, a lot like a president. He's a governor, she's a governor. In 48 of the 50 states, you have a 4-year term, just like the presidency, except for New Hampshire and Vermont, a veto pen, a pardon pen, written constitutions, bills of rights, minority rights, judicial review, bicameralism, except in Nebraska, two-party system, same two parties in all the 50 states in America, single-member districts, first past the post. Your states are little versions of Americas, and your governors are little versions of presidents. Indeed, many presidents have been former governors. And we don't pick our governors with some little mini electoral college in Texas, in Virginia, in Connecticut. Here's what we do. Call us crazy, but we have people run. The person who gets the most votes wins. If it's close, we recount carefully. That's how we roll in Texas and Pennsylvania and Virginia and everywhere else, and it works just fine. And so most of the arguments that actually you hear against the Electoral College aren't good ones, because if they were good ones, states are stupid and states aren't stupid. And so if you really need an Electoral College to avoid third-party candidates, well, then the states are stupid, but the states actually managed to avoid that just fine. Thank you. And in fact, better, way better than the federal system has, which has actually generated third-party candidates who happen to be regional candidates, because the Electoral College makes someone who's regionally a contender into a factor in which, and that wouldn't happen if you had national popular election, and that's George Wallace, and that's Strom Thurmond. I could talk about Ross Perot. I could talk about spoilers like Ralph Nader. So with all due respect, the third-party argument is actually a bad one, just empirically. It's not true. You'll get a two-party system because there are two parties in America, because there's one seat up for grabs, it's called the presidency, just like you get it for senator and governor, or within individual states for congressional members. It's called Duverger's law, where there's one seat up for grabs, you're going to have two parties in long-term equilibrium. So you don't need it for that. Oh my God, fraud. Well, states managed to actually do this, you see, and we recount carefully. Cities are going to overwhelm the process. This is one that Alan didn't quite say, but I like the least because I think it's a little bit racially coded. Not Fallon makes it, but some other people make it. But in California, we don't say, oh, it's just going to be all about Los Angeles and San Diego and California. Or in Virginia, we don't say, oh, it's just going to be all about Richmond. Or in Pennsylvania, oh, it's going to be about Philadelphia and Pittsburgh or something. We count all the votes equally and carefully, and we manage to deal with voter fraud in each of the 50 states, and it works just fine. And if you don't want things going too fast, oh, let's slow down. You got 50 states, and they look a lot like the federal model. To repeat, written constitutions, bills of rights, judicial review, bicameralism, a presidential system in which the executive is elected separately with veto pens and checks and balances, and it works just fine. So the slow down argument doesn't work, and oh, we need this in order to avoid third parties, incidental benefit, that's not a good argument. But federalism is an argument that maybe we should have a different system for the presidency than we should have for governors. And I'm going to come back to it because I actually do think there are some problems with a one person, one vote idea, which is just everyone's vote counts equally. And you've heard one person, one vote sometimes in connection with how legislature should be apportioned, or you shouldn't have malapportionment. A district should be equal sized. That's sometimes called one person, one vote, but that's never going to be perfect because even if the districts have the same population, they may have different number of registered voters or actual voters in different elections. There was a census 10 years ago, but people have moved in and moved out. That's never going to be perfect, but this is so much easier than that. It's just like a Senate election, just like a governor's election. You just count up all the votes for a single race, and whoever gets the more votes, that's the winner. And if it's close, you recount them carefully, and we manage to achieve legitimacy. And in fact, a whole bunch of times in American history, it's been clear who won the national popular vote, but the Electoral College has been very close and fraught. See Bush versus Gore in 2000, a few hundred votes in Florida actually were decisive, but nationwide, it was clear by more than 1 million votes who had more votes nationally. So now I'm going to tell you, so the big idea is equality. Everyone counts equally. And the institutional argument is states manage this just fine for their governors who look a lot like presidents. And now I'm going to tell you what the big problems are for Electoral College reform, because I do think there are problems. One problem is you're going to need a national vote apparatus to implement this thing. And we haven't ever had a system in which a vote for Pennsylvania is in the same bucket as a vote from Virginia. And that's there are going to be some complexities there. We're going to need to, if the idea is equality, that's an idea of uniformity. So we're probably going to have some more uniform national standards about voting. Because otherwise, and these are problems with my own position. I'm trying to be honest with you because we're friends and we're fellow citizens, all of us. And so one problem is going to be connected to federalism. California says, oh, you know, in this direct election system, the more Californians vote, the better it is for California. And up to a point, that's good. That is federalism. California might say, oh, we're going to make Election Day a voter holiday. And New York might say, oh, we're going to have easy absentee voting. And Oregon might say, actually, we're going to let you do in-person voting for 2 weeks, all of which to make it actually easier to vote. And that's federalism at its best. That's Brandeisian laboratory states competing to offer better versions of democracy. I like all that. And up to a point, that would be great. But only up to a point, and the national government is going to need to step in when that point is passed. So California says, we've got a bright idea. We're going to let 17-year-olds vote because there are going to be more Californians in the pool. And Texas says, oh, that's a really interesting idea, California. You know what? We're going to let 16-year-olds vote. And Arkansas says, actually, we're going to let dogs vote. And you're going to need national oversight with a lot of national voting apparatus to monitor the system. That's all true. And voter fraud is an issue. Of course, it's an issue within states, and they have institutions, mechanisms to deal with that. But you're going to need a national mechanism if we have a national popular vote. Here are a couple of the biggest argument, seems to me, to not have a constitutional reform system is, oh, the devil you know, probably it might be better than the devil you don't, just inertia. All these pointy-headed academics who come up with good ideas and all the rest, there are unanticipated consequences of every good reform, and precisely because they're unanticipated, we may not know what they are, but I just made a good old-fashioned Burkean argument that maybe we should just stick with what we got, even though it's not perfect. That's an argument that could explain why we pick governors one way and presidents a different way. Federalism of some sort might explain that in some ways, but most of the other arguments don't work because if they really were good arguments, Texas is stupid and California is stupid and Virginia is stupid when it comes to picking governors, and they're not. So most of the arguments that you hear for the Electoral College, 80% of them basically are hogwash. But federalism is a good argument, and inertia is a good argument, and unanticipated consequences need to be thought through. Two quick things, and then I'll shut up and we'll have a conversation. One, if without a constitutional amendment, you could try to improvise a national popular vote. There are ways of trying to do that, national popular vote, interstate compact. There are other ways. I actually helped originate some of these ideas. If you had a national popular vote, interstate compact, which we could talk about a little bit more in the back and forth, you will need a congressional statute, and it's going to have to be a very elaborate congressional statute to actually implement a national popular vote system. It's going to require a lot of regulation. And states can't do this on their own. And I'm the first one to concede that. I actually wrote that in the first draft of the thing. And the folks who took it up politically didn't contact me because I would have explained to them it's very important to have a national legislative buy-in and an elaborate apparatus to enforce the thing. Final thing, just to mention why we had this Electoral College idea at the founding. One thing that we haven't talked about, but I actually do believe not everyone does, is that slavery played a big role in the adoption of the Electoral College at Philadelphia and the modification of the Electoral College after the system seized up in the Adams-Jefferson-Burr election of 1801. You all are Virginians, so here's the story. James Wilson from Pennsylvania says, you know, we should actually have direct popular vote for the president. It works well for governors. James Madison says, yeah, that's a good idea, but I've been doing the math. The South will lose every time because we have a huge percentage of our population as slaves. Slaves can't vote, and so we're going to get outvoted all the time. Oh, but if we had some way of kind of counting the slaves in some way, maybe the Southerners could go for that. That's the Electoral College system. Virginia gets to count its slaves, albeit at 3/5. By 1800, Wilson's Pennsylvania has more voters and more free men than Virginia. Virginia has more electoral votes. 8 of the first 9 presidential elections are won by a Virginian. What a coincidence. 2 terms for Washington, 2 terms for Jefferson, for Madison, for Monroe. It creates a big advantage for slave states because they can count their populations at 3/5. And even later in American history, it's going to allow states to make it hard for people to vote and not pay a price. Because even if only a few Virginians vote, Virginia still has the same number of electoral votes. In 1915, if you had direct election of president, that would have encouraged states to let women vote much quicker, because a state that let women vote would play a bigger role in a national popular vote system. Even today, if you had a national popular vote system, the easier it is, the more convenient it is to vote, the more people from your state would be part of this national popular vote system, and states at the margins would have incentives to actually make it easier for people to vote rather than hard to vote. And that's a good thing to make it easier for people to vote. That's federalism at its best, and the national popular vote system could accomplish that. Not everyone understood the slavery bias of the original system, but they did. When the early elections are all not big state versus small state people, but North against South, 2 contests between Adams and Jefferson. Adams wins the North twice, Jefferson wins the South twice. It's decided in the middle of the country. And Adams understands, and all Adams advocates understand, that although Jefferson won in 1800, he got 13 extra electoral votes because of the 3/5 clause. And you take away those 13 electoral votes, actually, Adams would have won that election, and all the Northerners know that. Gary Wills writes a very famous book about this called Negro President. People at the time, the sore losers, say, Mr. Jefferson is riding into the executive mansion on the backs of his slaves. Because of slavery, he's winning. More free people voted for John Adams. Knowing all of that, Americans modified the Electoral College system in certain ways, allowing separate election for president and vice president, but didn't change the 3/5 skew, the slavery skew. That's not an argument today, because the world is very different today. It is a point, though, about the historical origins of the Electoral College. It's just worth mentioning because you might hear about it in other debates. To end, there are reasons to keep the Electoral College. I think the 2 biggest ones are some kind of federalism argument. We might need to figure out exactly why we think governors are different than presidents, and just plain old inertia, because it's the system that we have. It's not perfect at all. Right now, I think it has a skew toward the Republican Party, but it didn't in 2000, and it might not in 2040, and that's not my argument today, is any kind of partisan one. I believed in electoral college reform, one person, one vote forever. And it was possible that Al Gore could have won the electoral college vote while losing the popular vote in 2000. Today, it does skew Republican by about, Nate Silver says there's about a 10 or 11% chance that Donald Trump could lose the popular vote but win the electoral college this time around. But that's not why I favor electoral college reform. I favor it because I believe in basically the equality of all Americans. And with that, I think let's move to the next stage.
Thank you, Akhil. So as the format is structured, Alan, you've got 5 minutes to respond, and then we'll come back to Akhil for 5 minutes to respond, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So, Alan?
Okay. Akhil has covered so much ground and so ably. 5 minutes. Oh my goodness, how can I possibly deal? It's almost like an insult to Akhil. But let me just try to highlight a few things. The argument from equality, the argument from one man, one vote, is a potent argument. It resonates with every democratic fiber in our being. But press it a little hard and the problems start to emerge. First of all, there is the matter of scale. The state of Delaware, for instance, has got 900,000 voters. That is reasonably easy to manage and to supervise. But do it in a nation of 330 million, that's a different story. And we may be underestimating the degree of reconstruction that would be necessary for that to take place. And I mean serious reconstruction to the Constitution itself. After all, the description of the Electoral College and how the Electoral College is supposed to function is the single longest component in the Constitution. There is no provision in the Constitution for a popular vote. The only mechanism in the Constitution is the Electoral College. And the Constitution devotes approximately 10% of its length to the discussion of the mechanism of the Electoral College. So trying to move to a national popular vote system or something like that, that certainly has the appeal of one man, one vote. The question is implementing it. In many cases, and I should say, curiously, James Madison, when he was talking about governors in 1788, Madison actually did propose an electoral college-like system for electing Virginia governors in 1788. And this is in a letter he writes to Jefferson. So there actually was recommendation from James Madison, at least, that in fact governors in the states ought to be elected on the same electoral college model as the presidents of the United States. But let me move from that to dealing with the question that I think is somewhat more dubious, and that is that the Electoral College is somehow tainted by slavery. If that's the case, then really the whole Constitution is tainted by slavery. So perhaps we should just junk the whole thing. But I don't think we really want to do that. That certainly is not what Akhil is saying. But to come to the point of it, was the Electoral College designed or intended to favor the slave states so that the 3/5 clause could give the South an advantage? I don't think so. And the chief reasons why are as follows. First of all, in 1787, they were all slave states, except for Massachusetts, which had only taken a step away from slavery through a decision in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. There was no added advantage for the slave states because in 1787, that was how you described everybody, except for Massachusetts. In fact, a number of northern states will continue to legalize slavery well into the 19th century. New York, for instance, did not get rid of slavery until 1827. In 1860, there are still 18 legal slaves on the books in the state of New Jersey. So in 1787, there was no thought that there was going to be a distinction between slave states and free states. The members of the Constitutional Convention don't have crystal balls. They don't see what's happening there. So they're not doing this. They're not structuring this through the 3/5 clause to give some kind of added thumb on the platter for the slave states. They were all slave states. The other thing which enters into this is that the advantage that the slave states, when we do start dividing into free and slave states, the advantage which the slave states derive from the Electoral College is actually pretty marginal. When you look at the numbers, the only election which really hinges on that 3/5 advantage is the election of 1800. From the time of 1800 onwards, the 3/5 clause has diminishing importance. I mean, even in 1796, the North already had something like 53% of the electors. That figure by 1840 increases to 57%, and then by 1860 to 60%. When Southerners looked for protection of slavery in what became the slave states, they didn't look for it in the 3/5 clause or the Electoral College. They looked for it in parity in the Senate, the parity that all states enjoy in the Senate, having 2 senators from each state. So the argument about favoritism to the South as slave really doesn't enter terribly much into this. In fact, there's really not any discussion in the Constitutional Convention that links slavery with the creation of the Electoral College. They're never really discussed in the same context. And the reason for that is that no one really saw there was a connection there. So one man, one vote, yes, we resonate with that. But the actual implementation of it, we don't even do that, for instance, in how we elect senators, because it's always going to be 2 senators from each state. What's more, we don't even do it with the House of Representatives. I don't get to vote for the representatives from Delaware. I live in Pennsylvania. I vote for representatives only who are going to represent Pennsylvania. I don't have a say in how people are elected from other states, and yet I'm under the jurisdiction of that same House of Representatives. So one man, one vote, it is a great formula, but we have to watch carefully. How are we actually implementing it? How does it actually work? And I'm not sure it actually works against the Electoral College. Same argument I would make in terms of the taint of slavery with the Electoral College. Historically speaking, it's probably much, much significantly less than it looks at first blush. I'll turn it back to Akhil.
Thank you, Alan. Akhil, your response, and then after that, we'll go to questions.
Great, thanks. So Alan and I agree about lots of things. We don't actually think that the key issue of reform today is slavery. And I'll tell you one other reason why you might be opposed to reform. Alan didn't emphasize it quite so much, that if you don't trust, let's say, President Trump, right now, one thing about the Electoral College is he's not in charge of the election in, say, Pennsylvania. In fact, it's controlled by a Democratic governor. And if you have actually direct election, you're going to need some sort of apparatus to make sure the incumbent presidents don't rig nationwide elections in favor of themselves. At the state level, that's accomplished by having officials other than the governor in charge of voting administration, secretaries of state, secretaries of election, and all the rest. And the federal executive is actually different. So there are reasons to be skeptical of reform. And I'm trying to be candid with you about them. And I don't think slavery is the best argument for reform. All that said, I can't resist taking the bait that my fellow historian and friend Alan has tossed out. So saying that all states had slavery is like saying, all cities in America have hippopotami. Yeah, if you go to the Bronx Zoo, you can find one. But slavery is less than 3% in Massachusetts, even before it's eliminated in 1780, 83, and it's 40% in Virginia. 40% of Virginians are slaves, okay? And it's 2% or less in Pennsylvania. So you do the math. Okay? Pennsylvania has the same number of free people as Virginia in 1800, more voters because they have lower voter qualifications, and way fewer electoral votes, because Virginia is adding, 40% of its population times 0.6 multiplied by 3/5. So it's a huge advantage for states that have lots of slaves. Here's what James Madison says at Philadelphia. The right of suffrage was much more diffusive, that's extensive in the northern states than the southern states, and the latter, that is the southern states, could have no influence in the election on the score of Negroes, okay? So he's talking about slavery, and he elsewhere in Philadelphia very prominently says The difference in America is not between big states and small states. America doesn't divide, never divides, except at Philadelphia itself, big state versus small state. It has always divided north against south, coast against the middle, and cities against rural areas. And Madison says emphatically at Philadelphia, the big division in America is between north and south. It's not between big states and small states. Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia don't have that much in common. It's not big states versus small states. It's north against south. And Madison says explicitly that's because of slavery. That's all just straight out of Fran, I promise you. And America's, if I did a share screen, which I won't, I'd show you all these elections in American history. They're north against south, coast against the center, and cities against urban areas. But it's not big state, small state. It's north against south. Madison says all of that, but put all that to one side. Even if you aren't persuaded by any of that, all the elections early on are north against south. And the big state guy wins every time or comes in second every time. And in 1800, everyone with eyeballs sees that 13 extra electoral votes are going to Jefferson, and northerner after northerner says we should amend the Electoral College to get rid of that. If we're amending the Electoral College to fix an issue between vice president and president, because Jefferson and Burr tied. So the 12th Amendment says we're going to vote separately for presidential candidates and vice presidential candidates. So you won't have ties between presidential candidates and their running mates, between Jefferson's and Burr's of the future. So the Northerners again and again and again say, as long as we're amending the Constitution, let's fix this 3/5 thing. It was huge. It was the margin of victory, and America doesn't do that. So I'm actually a law person, and I'm telling you, I'd love to actually prove discrimination, because I got a smoking gun from James Madison. I got massive disparate impact. I've got this modification of the rule later on, knowing about that massive disparate impact. They got people saying, let's fix the thing, and they don't fix the thing. So I'm telling you now, I'm pulling rank as a law person. Oh, this is slam dunk as we lawyers understand discrimination. All that said, I'm with Alan in believing that's actually pretty irrelevant today, truth be told, about whether we should have electoral college reform or not. And Alan's right, lots of provisions of the Constitution might have had one purpose originally, having served different functions today. But I just couldn't resist the invitation, this one historian to another, to try to set the historical record straight, because now I'm going to say something very controversial. He's at a university that's very tied to James Madison, and I know you guys are Virginians, and his colleague Sean Wilentz is also, at Princeton, and Sean Wilentz and I debated the same topic that Alan and I did, and Sean said some of the same things about how it wasn't about slavery, and actually I think that's preposterous. It absolutely was, and with every passing year, more and more historians who are looking at this are actually on my side. More and more lawyers are. So, and it's hard for the Princetonians to understand that. It's hard for people in Charlottesville to understand that, because it's Mr. Jefferson's university, but you have to get over that. And all that said, one final thing, since we're talking about Virginia, and then 30 seconds. There are not 12 states in play. There are not 10 states in play. There are 7 states in play today. There are only 7 states that are actually within 5 points. In 2008, 2012, there are only 4 states that were decided by 5 points or less. Virginia might be was one of them. It's no longer. North Carolina still might be. So the Electoral College really shortens the playing field and focuses candidates just on a few states. To repeat, today, look at Nate Silver, there are only 7 states that are currently within 5 points, Trump and Biden. And in 2008 and 2012, it was only 4 states that were decided by 5 points or less. Unfortunately, America is becoming increasingly red in the red states, increasingly blue in the blue states. That's not good for America, and that's why Alan and I have actually tried to show you a model about people who might disagree about some things can still be great pals.
So thank you both, and I do appreciate the modeling of the dialogue. Demonstrating that we can have disagreements, but they don't have to be mean-spirited, etc. Let me start the question with this, and this is I'm gonna make this it's a contemporary issue, but obviously it has historical links that go back to the founding. Just yesterday, if you were watching the news, you read or heard a story about supposedly the Trump campaign talking to election officials, legislative officials in Pennsylvania, about the idea of having the Pennsylvania legislature ignore the popular vote in Pennsylvania and instead put their own slate of electors forward. And it raised in my mind a question of behavioral practice versus constitutional practice. We've gotten into the habit of thinking that, we cast votes, whichever candidate wins, those electors go to the quote unquote Electoral College and vote for the president. But the reality is, the way the Constitution's written and the way laws in many states are written, legislatures can ignore the will of the people and choose their own slate of electors. How do we deal with that? That would be a crisis in modern American politics that would be really difficult for a lot of people to understand and appreciate.
They would have to do that before the election, because Congress has passed a statute saying what election day is. Once election day has happened, state legislatures have no role whatsoever in the process unless they've reserved a role to themselves by a law passed before election day. The issue is discussed in some detail in a lecture that I gave in Florida after Bush versus Gore in a book called The Law of the Land. So Congress, if you look at the Constitution, is authorized to specify the presidential election day, and it has done that. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Why the first Tuesday after the first Monday? Why not just the first Tuesday? Because if the first Tuesday is November 1st, it was worried that people might be hungover from Halloween, All Saints Day after All Hallows Eve. So that's why it's going to be the 2nd through the 8th. But that's in a congressional statute. So if Pennsylvania wants to do it, it better act now to do that. And oh boy, I wouldn't want to be on the ballot if I were any Pennsylvania legislator who voted to in effect take away that customary right of voters. And after 1828, the only state that didn't allow its citizens to vote for directly for president and presidential electors was South Carolina. And the reason it didn't is because there's malapportionment within South Carolina. It's all about slavery. Once again, their legislature is dominated by coastal slaveholding plantation regions, and in the legislature they're overrepresented. And if they actually had, in effect, one person, one vote among the voters in South Carolina, that would help the non-slave holding region. So even, I didn't know about this interesting letter that Madison sends to Jefferson about gubernatorial elections in Virginia, but that's also connected about slavery, not between slave states and free states, but between slave holding regions, tidewater areas of states versus non-slave holding regions. And I have a lot of data about all of that. In Virginia in particular, comparing, for example, Wheeling with Richmond, in my book, America's Constitution, a Biography. So there's the Electoral College is about northern states versus southern states and slavery originally. But if the legislature is getting involved, you're going to have malapportionment sometimes within states that's actually very much all about slavery. And so since 1860, every state has let its voters vote. And before 1860, between 1828 and 1860, the only state that didn't was South Carolina and South Carolina. Like, you got the message, South Carolina.
Yep, no, I got it. Alan, you want to respond to the?
Actually, discussions about what can go wrong with a presidential election, and especially the mechanism of the Electoral College, that's been going on for several months now. And the Pennsylvania situation that you described actually was the subject of a rather lengthy review in the current issue of the New York Review of Books. So this has been a subject of attention now for a while. What happens in the current environment of election, where in, for instance, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we have a a fairly generous provision about mail-in ballots. What happens if the mechanism for counting those ballots is delayed or questioned? You could have a situation where the legislature wants to say, all right, as of this moment, candidate A is leading, and therefore the electoral votes of Pennsylvania should go to candidate A. But the governor, and in this case, the Pennsylvania legislature being Republican, the governor being Democrat, you see there's a division there. The governor could say, oh, wait, there are yet these votes which need to be counted. We have to have every vote counted that is made. And therefore, I will certify the results based on that. Then the legislature comes back and says, no, 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 those votes were over the deadline. We don't count votes that are sent in or that are attempted to be cast past that specific election day, according to the election laws. Well, then you've got the governor certifying one group of electors, you've got the legislature certifying another group of electors, and you have a major confrontation then. The question then will go into the courts. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court tends to lean Democratic, so that'll probably go into the federal courts. Well, you can see what's going to happen. We're going to have, with Pennsylvania, the possibility of a contested election that's going to drag on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and who knows what the exact resolution is going to be. Pennsylvania, that's one state out of 50. So the attention that's being devoted to this is unfortunately not unrealistic. People are worrying about how the results of the election are going to be interpreted, they're going to be read. What is a legislature going to do? What is a governor going to do? What's going to happen if they are at odds? We actually had a situation similar to this in 1876, where in two key states, you had rival legislatures, rival legislative factions. You had a governor representing one faction, the legislature speaking for another. And what you get as a result is two separate sets of electors being certified for those states, in this case, the states of South Carolina and Louisiana. That had to be resolved by a novelty. And the novelty was the creation of an electoral commission. And the Electoral Commission drags things out so far that they don't actually get a resolution until literally the eve of Inauguration Day. So the concern about this is a genuine one. It's not simply a party matter. It is possible for the system under the current election laws. It is possible for the system to face serious challenges. And it reminds me of what was always supposed to be the first prayer of every judge of elections, which was, Lord, make it a landslide, so there would be no question. But I'm afraid that we are looking increasingly, we have been since 2000, looking at elections where there have been more and more questions this way. So I'm actually not surprised that people in a variety of places, in a variety of formats, are starting to take thought for, well, what's going to happen if, how should we respond to this in that situation? Unfortunately, it's all too real.
The Electoral Count Act of 1887 is a congressional statute that deals with a lot of these things that have arisen in the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876. There is basically, under existing law, no good argument whatsoever for a state legislature to try to jump in after election day. State laws don't currently provide for that in any state. No state legislature tried to do that. Florida made noises about that. They didn't do it in the end. I wrote long afterwards saying it's a good thing they didn't, because that would have been outrageous because of the Electoral Count Act. Legislators actually don't certify things, okay? Judges decide contested issues of state law, and it would be state judges in the main, and state executive officials certify. There might be an interesting question. I don't know enough about Pennsylvania. My friend Alan is from Pennsylvania, about Secretary of State versus a governor. And if they were of opposite political parties, that might be an interesting thing. But the legislature basically has no role whatsoever, and shame on those who are trying to suggest that. That's just throwing monkey wrenches into the system, and we haven't done that at all. And I think that's very decisive what I just said, I think a majority of the Supreme Court of members of both parties would very much agree
Yeah,
with.
I agree. And I think though the question is, who is the one who is going to be caught holding the monkey wrench? Is it going to be the legislature or is it going to be the governor? And we have had a very contentious year with the governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Mr. Wolf, who has really created a lot of aggravation with the way that the COVID situation has been handled and the shutdown. I mean, there are billboards on the Pennsylvania Turnpike that show someone, throwing their hands up in the air with a picture of Tom Wolf behind them saying, "Don't blame me, I voted for Wagner," the previous gubernatorial candidate. So there is a crisis of confidence that way. And all of these things in the environment of a sharply contested election are going to create all kinds of temptations and all kinds of difficulties. How we can avoid them, all we can do is take our guidance from the law. And my great anxiety is that too often people have worked themselves up to a point where they're willing to set aside the rule of law and only consult their passions.
And this is a point on your side, Alan. This is federalism. See, if it were a national popular vote, and it would be a national apparatus, maybe controlled by an incumbent president, that makes me very nervous. It's not, it's 50 states, but I'm telling you the key person in the state is never the legislature after election day. That's very clear from existing law and practice. It would be the state judges sometimes who do get involved in contested elections, and the state executive officials, and it might matter whether it's a governor or secretary of state, but that's federalism, okay? And this time it happens to be team blue. If it comes down to Pennsylvania, it's a Democratic governor. Oh, in 2000, it was team red. It was Katherine Harris and Jeb Bush, whose brother happens to be a fellow named George W. Bush. Okay, so kind of what goes around comes around. But that time it was a governor, red governors in a close state. This time it's a blue governor. But that's federalism. That was your first point.
So there have been, as I look through the questions, this is a composite question because I've seen several questions that are something like this. As far as I know, Nebraska and Maine are the only two states that essentially say they're going to allocate their electors by congressional district. Wouldn't that kind of split the difference between your two arguments? A national popular vote might not work so well, might not be consistent with some of the early constitutional requirements, but we want to move somewhat toward the popular will. What if we recreated an electoral college that said, there are 435 electors, they get allocated by each congressional district?
Yeah, and if you don't know anything, with all due respect, if you don't know anything, that sounds really great. That's an utterly stupid idea, and I'm going to explain. I'm going to be very straight. I know I use a harsh word, stupid. Okay, here, like 5 or 6 basic points. First of all, congressional districts are gerrymandered, and you're going to bring gerrymandering now into the presidential election process. 2, there's a reason why it's Nebraska and Maine and no others, and here's why. This is a math point. Nebraska has 5 electoral votes, 3 congressional districts plus 2 senators. Maine has 2. The other 48 are winner take all. In Maine and Nebraska, mathematically, it's winner take most, because if you win the state, you automatically get 2 votes for winning the state, the Senate seats, and you get 1 extra electoral vote for every congressional district you win. You can't win Maine without winning 1 of the 2 congressional districts, so you're going to get 2 for winning Maine and at least that third one. Can't lose both districts and win the state. So you're going to get 3 or 4, it's winner take most. In Nebraska, you can't win the state unless you win at least 1 of those districts. And so you win the state, that's 2. You win the 3rd district, that's 3. So you're going to get 3, 4, or 5. That doesn't work for any state. Let's take Pennsylvania. It's got 18 electoral votes. One party, would be the Democratic Party, could win actually Pennsylvania as a whole, but actually win only 1 district in Pennsylvania by an overwhelming margin, lose every other district, by 1 vote, and you'd end up with someone who won the state getting 3 electoral votes, 2 from the statewide, 1 from that district, and 15 on the other side. That's not winner take all. That's not even winner take most. That's a disaster. Right now, the Electoral College is not badly skewed in favor of one party or the other. It is skewed. It wasn't in 2000, but the reason it's not skewed is because of winner take all. Because Democrats tend to win most big states. Let's say in an average election, 7 out of 10. They win 7 out of 10 big states, and winner take all gives them a big bonus. The Republicans benefit because they win more states overall, and they get 2 extra electors per state, especially big states where no one lives, like Wyoming, big boxes in the middle of the country. Those 2 skews offset each other almost perfectly right now. Democrats win 7 out of 10 big states, and winner take all gives them a bonus. Republicans win more states overall, and especially states where no one lives, like Montana and Wyoming. I'm being crude here, and that gives them an offset and about equals out. If you got rid of winner take all, the Electoral College would skew massively toward the Republican Party. It seems like a neutral thing. It's not. It brings gerrymandering in a very big way because congressional districts, are not actually drawn by the angels. So it will result in a much bigger systematic divergence. Even though you might think, oh, it's closer to mathematical rounding and all the rest, it's going to move us way further from the Electoral College as a pretty close approximation of the national vote. So it's a partisan scheme if you know math.
I'd add to that. I agree with Akhil that way, and I'd actually push it a little further. Maine and Nebraska can seem to work that way because Maine and Nebraska are, after all, not big states. But let's take Texas. Texas has got 38 electoral votes. And by the rule of winner take all, even though 3.8 million Texans voted for Mrs. Clinton in 2016, nevertheless, all of the 38 electoral votes for Texas went to Mr. Trump. So the argument has been put forward, and Akhil, you know this because of the suit that David Boies filed, this was sometime last year, trying to overturn winner take all, arguing that it's a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause.
The Constitution is unconstitutional.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Only a Yale Law School graduate could say that. That's David Boies.
I'm glad we didn't tag Princeton that time. If we were to move to a proportional system for Texas, then what we would have to do would be on the percentages of voters for Mrs. Clinton or for Mr. Trump. We would have to divide the electoral vote of Texas as 15.5664 Texas electors for Mrs. Clinton and 18.8028 electors for Mr. Trump. That's great if you're a math major. Unfortunately, electors don't subdivide. So you have to decide whether it's going to be 15 or 16 electors for Mrs. Clinton, whether it's going to be 18 or 19 electors for Mr. Trump. And when you do that, what you do is you disfranchise a large number of people, because this is Texas. That 0.5664 Texas voters who poof into non-existence, that's 236,000 people. So it's to move in that direction in the name of voter equality or one man, one vote, or even proportion. That doesn't solve the problem of who is being represented and whether people are being disfranchised, because in the large states, given the percentages, you're going to disfranchise a lot of people anyway. So you haven't solved the problem.
You haven't. You made it worse, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
You've made it very partisan, even without the gerrymandering, because Alan's thing is not about districts, it's about proportional. And I saw there was a question in the chat about that. Proportionality makes the problem worse rather than better because it introduces more partisan skew into the process. And again, you might not understand that, but I promise you, I'm good at math. I'm very good at math. I have some math trophies behind me here. So the math actually at first seems sensible, but in fact, actually it's bad, because right now the one thing you can say is the Electoral College doesn't have a massive partisan skew. This would introduce a massive partisan skew. And in a two-party system, you do not want one party thinking the whole thing is even more fundamentally illegitimate. It's very important that both parties buy into it.
So I'm gonna read this question just so I get it right. Dr. Guelzo raised some concerns about a multitude of parties. Should the Electoral College be amended? Dr. Amir did not raise the same concern, but he did argue in favor of a two-party system. But there are many successful countries, Great Britain, for example, with multipolar politics. In fact, some people argue that a bipolar system is too polarizing. How do you both feel about the success of a multipolar system in other countries versus our own? And I guess the subcontext of that is, how can the Electoral College encourage multi-party politics if in fact that would be better for us?
Well, I jump in and say there, not to compare apples and oranges, because in the British system, you're not in fact actually electing an executive. We call it the president, they would call it the prime minister. Nobody votes for the prime minister of Great Britain. The person who becomes the prime minister is the head of the particular party, which gains a majority in parliament. But that is not necessarily a reflection of the broader scope of the people. It certainly does not reflect people voting for a particular person in that office. The system in Britain is so much different from what we do that it's very difficult to make that kind of comparison. There are countries with multi-party systems. Once again, they are also different from ours because the electoral process is broken down in different ways. In Germany, for instance, you can have a multiplicity of parties, but you have a system for electing the Bundestag and electing for the principal officers of government, which actually makes our electoral college system look like the very model of simplicity. The German system for electing is fiercely complicated. You are effectively electing two entirely separate tickets. You're voting for two entirely separate tickets simultaneously, and I even have difficulty describing it. I can only say only the Germans could figure that out on an election day.
I've changed my mind on this issue since I wrote my first piece of scholarship called Student Note, if you're in law school, on proportional representation systems, multi-party systems. I thought, they're so good. Each system has its advantages and disadvantages. Democracies are better than non-democracies. We're better than China, we're better than Russia. But here are the four distinctions among the great world democracies. Some have written constitutions, some don't, like Britain and Israel. Some are two-party, like ours, strongly two-party. Some are multiple party. Some are strongly federal systems, as is ours. Others are unitary, like France. Some have written constitutions. Some are parliamentary and some are presidential. So those are just four binaries. That's actually 2 to the 4, 16 different permutations. Ours is a very strong two-party system. We've had the same two parties alternating in power for almost every important position: president, governor, senator, congressman. For almost every single position, state and federal, the same two parties alternating since Lincoln, for 150 years. And when it's not one of those two, remember those two parties, when it's Angus King from Maine or Jesse Ventura from Minnesota, that's a man bites dog story. Ours is a very strong two-party system, and it would be a shock to the system to try to switch it, like trying to redirect the Mississippi River. Maybe metric is better than the English system, inches and yards and pounds and gallons and all the rest, but that is our system. It's a very strong two-party, and here's what anchors the whole thing. A congressional statute from 1840, maybe it was 1842, that requires single-member districts for the House of Representatives, first past the post, when there's one congressman at issue in any given election, one senator, one president, one governor. In long-term equilibrium, you're going to have two parties. That's a thing called Duverger's law. All of this is discussed in great detail in a chapter of my book, America's Unwritten Constitution. Chapter 10 is all about the two-party system in America, and ours is a very strong two-party system. The same two parties. One final point: the parties can evolve. So if I showed you Electoral College maps from 1896 and 2008, they look almost identical. Country divides the same way: north against south, coast against the center. But the kick in the head is the parties have flipped from 1896 to today. The party of the former Confederacy, you see, is now actually, nominally Lincoln's party, the Grand Old Party. The tall, skinny constitutional lawyer from Illinois is now who wins Lincoln's coalition, the tall, skinny constitutional lawyer from Illinois. Oh, in our century, his name is Barack Obama. He's a Democrat. The parties have flipped, but it's the same basic division in America. We have the same two parties. They can evolve in all sorts of ways, but ours is a very strong two-party system. And if you tried to change that, it would be extremely disruptive if you're with Alan and me in thinking, go slow, don't introduce reforms that could actually backfire.
Let me put a historical footnote there too. I'd actually push the continuity of the parties back before Lincoln, because the Federalists and the Whigs and the Republicans do represent a lot of continuity. We could really say we have been functioning with a two-party system for the most part ever since Jefferson and Madison in the 1790s on one side, Hamilton and Adams on the other side. Again, so it's been there almost from the beginning. I'm
with you.
In what I would draw attention to is geographically, yes, they have changed a great deal, but that's because the demographics of the country have changed a great deal. The underlying political culture of the two parties has remained remarkably stable over the last 150, 175 years. The basic principles of a Jacksonian Democrat are still operating at a cultural level on pretty much the same bases as they are now, whereas the old Whig/Republican of the 1840s to the 1850s, again, those basic principles, those values, so to speak, at the level of political culture. I'm speaking about culture, not about explicit policies. Political culture, the stuff that's the 2/3 of the iceberg below the water, those have remained remarkably stable in terms of the political history of the parties, which is one reason why third or fourth parties have had a lot of difficulty getting traction in the American experience. And that is because most third or fourth parties or whatever tend to be based on personalities or immediate short-term policies, like Ross Perot. They don't tend to have the ballast of political culture, whereas your Jeffersonian, Jacksonian Democrats, your Whig Republicans, they do have that long-term ballast. That is a long-term historical phenomenon that I think actually provides a good deal of stability in terms of party identity.
Well, that's a subject for another debate, because I would say 1965 affects a major realignment in which basically a solidly Democratic South that's connected to, that linearly descends from Jefferson Davis and goes through Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats, actually becomes Republican. And now it's basically a Republican South. The party of the Confederacy today is the Republican Party. But that's a subject for a different debate about realignment in 1965.
Right. And about demographics, because the demographic change there, I think, is the key one.
Yeah. So thank you both. We have actually, amazingly enough, we've gone through our 75 minutes of time. I'm disappointed that we don't have time for Alan to close us out with a cello.
Double bass. It's a double bass. It's bigger than a cello.
I'm just looking at it in the background. So thank you both for giving me the opportunity to moderate, and I'm going to turn it back over to Liz at this point.
I just want to thank everyone for coming and our participants. And I need to give a quick shout out to Dr. William White, who has helped me on the backside of this, figuring out how to run a Zoom webinar. So I look forward to all of us meeting in person one of these days. And I thank you both so much for sharing your insights. This was very helpful.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Akhil. It was great to be on the program again with you. Look forward to the next one that we're going to do. And to all of our friends, hello and goodbye to all of our friends at Christopher Newport University.
Thank you. Have a good one, everyone.